And I'm not going to a ball. I thought I'd try and look like Ellen Olenska in The Age of Innocence. And I hope you're going to see the film. The film, I'm so pleased, The Death in Venice is on tomorrow, and it's an absolute masterpiece, the Visconti film. It's at 1:15 tomorrow before the lecture on Death in Venice, and so it's in the Economics Theatre, I believe. So do be there. We're all going to fight for seats, aren't we? Okay. And you know what this course is going to be about. It's fairly obvious, isn't it, if not a little flat-footed love in modern literature. The idea behind it, of course, is that the concept of love has changed enormously over the period from medieval times, when we more or less become aware of English literature as English literature, up till the present day. In the medieval times, you know, we have this cliché of the lover gazing up adoringly at the mistress on a pedestal. Mistress not in the modern sense, of course, far away and on the pedestal. And then, even into the 16th century, with the sonnet sequences, you get that same concept of the worshipping lover at some distance, although, of course, in Elizabethan times, we don't really believe it's distance, but never mind. But the lover still worshipping the woman. But by the 19th century, you get a much clearer idea of a modern sense of love, although, of course, still looking very old-fashioned as we look back, because in the 19th century, true love usually ends with marriage. That constitutes successful love. When you think about Pride and Prejudice, of course, you know how we yearn, ladies, I don't know about the gentlemen, how we yearn for Darcy to propose again to dear old awkward Elizabeth, whom nobody but myself, oh no, that was Emma, wasn't it? Nobody but myself will love. So that is the idea behind it. I've had problems choosing, you'd think it would be easy, but I've had problems choosing that poem I insist on at the beginning of each lecture, because there is so much love poetry. But I haven't been able to find a love poem that is entirely appropriate to today's course. So I've chosen one that is about forbidden love in a more general sense. Forbidden, that is, when W.H. Auden wrote it in 1937. He was referring to homosexuality. I, of course, have grabbed it for a course on a man who is married, respectably married, and hopelessly in love with a woman he's not supposed to be. Feels more love, perhaps, for Ellen than he ever felt for his wife, May. So let's start, and I'll start with the poem. Lay your sleeping head, my love, human on my faithless arm. Time and fevers burn away individual beauty from thoughtful children, and the grave proves the child ephemeral. But in my arms till break of day, let the living creature lie, mortal, guilty, but to me the entirely beautiful. Soul and body have no bounds to lovers as they lie upon her tolerant, enchanted slope in their ordinary swoon. Grave the vision Venus sends of supernatural sympathy, universal love and hope. While an abstract insight wakes among the glaciers and the rocks, the hermit's carnal ecstasy. Certainty, fidelity, on the stroke of midnight pass like vibrations of a bell. And fashionable madmen raise their pedantic, boring cry. Every farthing of the cost all the dreaded cards foretell shall be paid. But from this night, not a whisper, not a thought, not a kiss nor look be lost. Beauty, midnight, vision dies. Let the winds of dawn that blow softly round your dreaming head such a day of welcome show, I and knocking heart may bless. Find the mortal world enough, noons of dryness find you fed by the involuntary powers. Nights of insult let you pass, watched by every human love. That's W.H. Auden from a collection called Another Time. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, published in 1920, is one of the most poignant stories of passionate love and its failures ever written. The novel is told almost entirely from the viewpoint of a man of impeccable New York ancestry, Newland Archer. And ancestry will come very much into this book, who in his mid-20s gets suitably engaged, you notice the suitably, to the adoring and beautiful May Welland. At exactly the moment, however, the unfortunate moment, that her rather more attractive to him cousin, Ellen Olenska, returns to New York from a rather dubious life on the continent, married to a Polish count. I suppose that's the extent of what could be daring in those days. And because we are led to suspect, because Newland feels obscurely attracted to this woman, who appears on the first opening scene, because he feels it, we believe, he insists that he and May Welland, to whom he's sort of more or less promised his hand, should announce their engagement. So we're already right in the middle, at the beginning of that plot. They're at the opera, and he wants to announce the engagement after the opera. The only thing the two young women, May and Ellen, have in common is that they are both granddaughters of the willful, unconventional, but wealthy and influential Mrs. Manson Mingott. And I'm afraid I can never, especially after having met Miriam Margolyes, I can never think of Mrs. Manson Mingott without seeing Miriam Margolyes, who's not quite as plump as she looks in the film in real life. So they're both granddaughters, but they're in every other way. They are very different indeed. They're both sitting in her opera box. She's far too large to be able to get into the opera box anymore, and so she lets her relatives use it. And they're listening to Gounod's Faust, which is a tale of the seduction and ruin of young Gretchen, a tale of innocence and sexual attraction. And the contrast between these two women is spelled out immediately as Newland surveys them from the club box full of New York's male elite. Here, first, is Newland's about-to-be fiancée, May. Now, I want to show you before we get there, and I'm sorry that these aren't in the right order, so we'll have to... There. That is the old opera house in New York, which is lovely, isn't it? It's, doesn't seem to work. Doesn't matter. But it's the old opera house which is down, and I'm going to talk about New York in a minute because I think the way in which New York has changed reflects the way in which society has changed over the intervening period. This is extract 2 on your sheet. Directly facing Newland Archer, our protagonist, was the box of old Mrs. Manson Mingott, whose monstrous obesity had long since made it impossible for her to attend the opera, but who was always represented on fashionable nights by some of the younger members of the family. On this occasion, the front of the box was filled with her daughter-in-law, Mrs. Lovell Mingott, and her daughter, Mrs. Welland, and that, of course, is May's mother. And slightly withdrawn behind these brocaded matrons sat a young girl, and you'll notice all the way through her use of colour, a young girl in white. It's not very subtle perhaps, but it does the trick, with eyes ecstatically fixed on the stage lovers. As Madame Nilsson's "Mama, he loves me" thrilled out above the silent house, the boxes always stopped talking during the Daisy song. A warm pink mounted to the girl's cheek, mantled her brow to the roots of her fair hair, and suffused the young slope of her breast to the line where it met a modest towel tucker fastened with a single gardenia. She dropped her eyes to the immense bouquet of lilies of the valley, and you know what colour lilies of the valley are, on her knee, and Newland Archer saw her white-gloved fingertips touch the flowers softly. So he drew a breath of satisfied vanity, and his eyes returned to the stage. I think we've got the point, don't you, about what white is. I better clean my steamed-up glasses. What white is supposed to signify here. In sharp contrast, here, and of course far more attractively to the 21st century, here is our first glimpse of Ellen Olenska. Note the difference in the colours they are wearing. May in virginal white, Ellen in more dramatic midnight blue, with a suggestive Josephine headdress. And of course you all know who Josephine was, don't you? Well, upon my soul, exclaimed Lawrence Lefferts, the leader of the pack. She has this wonderful imagery of these men like sort of baying hounds after the women and their reputations, turning his opera glasses abruptly away from the stage. My God, he said, and this is extract 3, silently handed his glass to old Sillerton Jackson. We don't know who these people are yet. Newland Archer, following Lefferts' glance, saw with surprise that his exclamation had been occasioned by the entry of a new figure in old Mrs. Mingot's box. It was that of a slim young woman, a little less tall than May Welland, with brown hair growing in close curls about her temples, and held in place by a narrow band of diamonds. What was then called the Josephine look was carried out in the cut of the dark blue velvet gown, rather theatrically caught up under her bosom by a girdle with a large old-fashioned clasp. The wearer of this unusual dress, who seemed quite unconscious of the attention it was attracting, stood a moment in the centre of the box, discussing with Mrs. Welland the propriety of taking the latter's place, and so on. Ellen, who's grown up mainly abroad, as I mentioned to you, and is thoroughly Europeanized, is rumoured to have run away with her husband's secretary. That makes her even more exciting than that low-cut dress. And she's trying to escape from her husband and has returned to her childhood scene of New York. And the irony which starts here and runs throughout the book is that she thinks she's going to be safe in New York. The age of innocence. It turns out that that's not going to be anything but deeply ironic, the title. It's one of the many ironies, then, in The Age of Innocence from the title onwards, which suggests that she's going to look back on a vanished age, Edith Wharton, and that this retrospect is unlikely to be harsh, but actually, in the end, it's very harsh indeed. The original working title of the novel was Old New York, so it was less committed, less ironic. I especially want to give the atmosphere of Old New York, she said, and as you know, it's set in the early 1870s. But any idea that we can take the word innocence at its face value is quickly dispelled. And by the end of the novel, this word innocence, associated as it is with May and her scheming social network, is quite banished. Anything but. It has taken on an ominous ring. The title is almost certainly taken from a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds, and it was known as The Age of Innocence. I think its original title was A Little Girl, but it became known as The Age of Innocence. The story itself takes place in New York in the 1870s and is a perfect setting for this story of social constraint and hypocrisy. And this is what I think is very interesting indeed. I'm not great on maps, and I don't know how much of this you're going to see. Don't worry, if any of you are passionate about maps, I'll send it you in an email. But what interested me is that this claustrophobia that we feel from that first scene onwards is mirrored in the geography of New York at this time. Now, if I'm lucky, you'll be able to, yes, here we are. Can you see this line here? That is 40th Street. Now, anybody who's been to New York recently, like I have frequently, probably it stays somewhere around here. If you're lucky, you stay on the east side. If you're very lucky, you stay near the opera. But you certainly wouldn't stay, probably wouldn't stay below 40th Street, and you would be respectable anywhere above that to Harlem. So it's a very parochial place. Very, very parochial. And the most unconventional person of all in the book, Mrs. Manson Mingott, although she turns out to be just as bad as the rest of them in the end, in my opinion, is Mrs. Manson Mingott, who defies New York conventions. And Mrs. Manson Mingott lives right above the outer limits of respectability, just underneath, well, wonderful place to live, actually. Nowadays, you pay an arm and a leg for an apartment there. This is Central Park, of course, here. So wonderful place to live. But she's built right out in the wilds. I mean, this is when New York is still being developed. It was an original Dutch settlement, wasn't it? But I won't go on about the geography. I have a student who's a geographer, and she said to me, do you know what it was like in 1870? And this was the result. I mean, it's really quite fascinating to me. And the effect of this smallness is that everybody knows everybody else. You go out for a walk, it's like being in a village, isn't it? And so really, by the end of the book, Ellen feels she's living in a prison. She says, you know, where in your houses do you find a place to talk privately? She said, everything's so public. And of course, she can't even go out into the street without being followed. Newland, who has congratulated himself as an admirer of European art and literature on having read more widely and known a lot more than all his colleagues, prides himself in what he considers his objective view of his narrow social world. He thinks he's above it. But he's basically as conventional and frightened, timid as the rest of them, a naturally unassertive man. But he's also shown as an honest man, so he's not painted entirely black, with a sense of justice, however condescendingly manifested. And this is manifested mainly, I might say, towards the girl he's going to marry, May Welland, whom I dislike intensely, but only because of the film, because I can't stand the Winona Ryder in it. Don't ever watch the film. Winona. May has had the usual, very limited education of a girl of her time. It's a book about women. It's a book about their education. It's a book about their limitations. It's a book about men's attitude to women from the opening page. She had, and this is extract 4, she had, and this is his tremendously condescending attitude towards her, she had advanced far enough to join him in ridiculing the idylls of the king, you know, that's Tennyson, but not to feel the beauty of Ulysses by Tennyson and the Lotus Eaters. She was straightforward, loyal, and brave. She had a sense of humour, chiefly proved by laughing at his jokes. And he suspected in the depths of her innocently gazing soul a glow of feeling that it would be a joy a joy to awaken. But when he had gone the brief round of her, he returned discouraged by the thought that all this frankness and innocence were only an artificial product. Untrained human nature was not frank and innocent. It was full of the twists and defences of an instinctive guile, and he felt himself oppressed by this creation of factitious purity, so cunningly manufactured by a conspiracy of mothers and aunts and grandmothers and long-dead ancestresses, because it was supposed to be what he wanted, what he had a right to, in order that he might exercise his lordly pleasure in smashing it like an image made of snow. She doesn't have a very strong opinion of men and New York society, does she? But you'll see why in a minute. But at least Newland is no hypocrite when it comes to sexual mores. He's had his affairs, and that's all right. The young man sows his wild oats, doesn't he? That's okay. There was a certain triteness in these reflections, he said, in the second part of Extract 4. They were habitual to young men on the approach of their wedding day, but they were generally accompanied by a sense of compunction and self-abasement of which Newland Archer felt no trace. This is his redeeming feature. At least he isn't a hypocrite. He could not deplore, as Thackeray's hero so often exasperated him by doing, that he had not a blank page to offer his bride in exchange for the unblemished one she was to give to him. He could not get away from the fact that if he had been brought up as she had, they would have been no more fit to find their way about than the babes in the wood. And so it goes on. Ultimately, however, I'm sorry to report, Newland accepts society's double standards, as his thoughts in that first scene at the opera show, when he thinks, "The darling," thought Newland Archer, his glance flitting back to the young girl with the lilies of the valley. She doesn't even guess what it's all about. This is the seduction scene with Gretchen. And he contemplated, Extract 5, her absorbed young face with a thrill of possessorship in which pride in his own masculine initiation was mingled with a tender reverence for her abysmal purity. "We'll read Faust together by the Italian lakes," he says, and goes on. Wharton takes some delight at this point in revealing Newland's complacency. And here her considerable powers of satire come into play. I mean, already I think you've seen how satirical she can be. He did not in the least wish the future Mrs. Newland Archer to be a simpleton. He meant her, thanks to his enlightening companionship, to develop a social tact and readiness of wit, enabling her to hold her own with the most popular married women of the younger set, in which it was the recognized custom to attract masculine homage while playfully discouraging it. All these metaphors, images of playing, of pretending, of all games that are going on in this society. But also, I think, as well as showing us that he really is quite enlightened about how bad it is for women, she also shows us his severe limitations. She has a certain amount of sympathy for him, but she shows most of it, as you've seen, through his point of view. It's very clever the way in which we get his point of view on it, and yet at the same time we ourselves are thinking, very smug, very complacent. Newland's honesty survives, however, and he is forced finally to recognize that through a failure of courage at the end of the book, we'll get to that later, he has missed what he has known from the start is the flower of life. And this is love. This is the love that we're talking about. The love that is forbidden in the society in which he is involved. He had done little in public life, Extract 6. He would always be, by nature, a contemplative and a dilettante. But he had had high things to contemplate, great things to delight in, and one great man's friendship. He'd been, in short, what people were beginning to call a good man. This is Newland later on. And then that last, very sad paragraph, something he knew he had missed, the flower of life. But he thought of it now as a thing so unattainable and improbable that to have repined would have been like despairing because one had not drawn the first prize in a lottery. At the start of the book, Newland, as a lawyer and member by marriage of the Welland family, is involved willy-nilly in the delicate question of Ellen Olenska's future. She comes back, she's run away from her husband, possibly with the secretary, as I say, and what are they to do with her? What do you do with a woman like that? Should she divorce the Count, with the resulting scandal to May's family? Or should she return to Europe, to her horrible, possibly depraved husband? Or should she resign herself to being Madame Olenska for the rest of her life and living alone forever? It's a very nice moral dilemma that she's placed in, because, of course, nobody knows the answer. And he, least of all, wants her not to get a divorce, because if she got a divorce, just possibly, he's not yet married to May, just possibly he might end up with Ellen. And yet, family loyalty dictates that he persuades her that she should not get a divorce. So the plot thickens very early on. Even as the inexorable process of his engagement, let's see if we can get to Grace Church, where they get married, his wedding and his married life with May proceed, Newland falls ever more deeply in love with Ellen, and she with him. This is very convincingly portrayed. There's one wonderful scene where he's driving her back from the station in a cab, and she has her glove undone, and he kisses her hand through the glove. And it's that terrible yearning that you feel in this tiny gesture. One feels that she must have had her hand kissed in that fashion at some point, Wharton, although she didn't have an awfully happy love life herself. And his desperate attempts to be with Ellen alone, as I've indicated to you, in this tiny parochial New York of the 1870s, is doomed to failure, thwarted at every turn by what Hermione Lee, who is a brilliant biographer of Edith Wharton, I don't know whether any of you have read her biography, brilliant biographer, and she says and points out that he is thwarted, and Ellen is thwarted at every turn by, quote, the coded strategies of the self-preserving New York network, in which May, for all her apparent innocence, a word which comes to seem deeply ironic, as I pointed out to you by the end of the book, is not only implicated, so May knows all about it, but pretends innocence, but active. So she's scheming away behind the white flowers and the white tulle border. Eventually, it transpires, Ellen must be got rid of. And that's part of what happens in the book. This is the scene, then, extract 7, at Ellen's farewell dinner, given, of course, by her loving cousin May, who can't wait to get rid of her, but is pretending mortification that she has to go. There were certain things that had to be done. And if done at all, done handsomely and thoroughly. And one of these, in the old New York Code, was the tribal rally round a kinswoman about to be eliminated from the tribe. There was nothing on earth that the Wellens and Mingots would not have done to proclaim their unalterable affection for the Countess Olenska, now that her passage for Europe was engaged. And Archer, at the head of his table, because he and May are forced to give the farewell dinner, Archer at the head of his table sat marvelling at the silent, untiring activity with which her popularity, because of course she's become most unpopular when they think she's going to destroy the fabric of their society, her popularity had been retrieved, grievances against her silenced, her past countenanced, and her present irradiated by family approval, now that she's going to go, of course. Ironically, all New York believes by now that Newland is Madame Olenska's lover, and he thinks if only. Including his wife, who has made quite sure he will never be able to leave him for Ellen. And she makes sure, in a way that I think we recognise from other fiction, she tells him that she is pregnant. But she not only tells him she's pregnant, she tells, and this is after 3 years of marriage, so she's obviously decided it's about time she became pregnant, she tells him that she has told Ellen 2 weeks before, which is why Ellen finally decides to go. Even though she didn't know she was pregnant, couldn't be sure she was pregnant, she tells Ellen. So there is quite obvious evidence of scheming on May's part. And it's a book full of this awful feeling of wasted emotions, wasted lives, wasted respectability. Wharton's copious notes for the Age of Innocence, fascinating, because it emerges that she had 3 possible scenarios for this. And you can see the problem, can't you? She's still writing in the 1920s when it's still a little bit difficult to write about these things. And she thinks, how can I deal with this relationship which I have at the centre of my mind? In one draft plan, she has Newland Archer fall in love with Ellen, break off his engagement to May, but is deeply shocked when Ellen suggests they try living together before they get married. So he goes off in great, great terror. They marry, and she realises she's going to be bored. So that's one draft. In another draft plan, the return of Clementina Olenska, a little bit more exotic perhaps, the return of Clementina to New York, escaping from a husband who is a charming drug taker, gambler and debauchee, the marriage of Newland Langdon, not Archer, and May and Newland's falling in love proceed as in the novel. But in this version, there's a nice little scene where he decides, after May gets pregnant, to go down to Florida to have a little fling with Ellen. A third and even fuller version, which Wharton headed "The Scene is Laid in 1875," adds a few more details. The lovers are given a few mad weeks together. Those are her words. But Ellen's inability to divorce her husband intervenes, and they don't go off together. In the end, Wharton chose unfulfillment for her lovers, and you may wonder why she did that. I mean, what is she? You feel all the way through she's trying to tell us something. What is she trying to tell us when she doesn't allow them to fulfill their love for each other? That is what life is like, perhaps, is what she's telling us. Perhaps we're even meant to feel that there is some value for the soul in not getting what you want. I'm awfully tired of people saying that, aren't you? But maybe this is what she's trying to indicate to us. Perhaps, too, in the intensity of old-fashioned, and this rather attracts me, this idea, perhaps in the intensity of old-fashioned thwarted love, as compared with the relative freedom of modern sexuality, there may be more passion and depth. I mean, think of that kiss on the wrist through the glove. I mean, it's much more exciting. Perhaps you don't agree. By current valuations, a love scene in which, quote, he had not so much touched her hand with his lips would be judged a failure, wouldn't it? Can you imagine writing that in a book in 2016 or 17? I don't think it would sell very well. But Newland, even though this is spelled out that there is a certain kind of intensity and passion in such a thwarted love, Newland will come to wonder, looking at the next generation's emotional arrangements, whether the thing one's so certain of in advance, quote, can ever make the heart beat so wildly. So it's an interesting book because it's not giving you any moral judgment, but it's showing you the reality of the situation as it unfolds for him. But it is a novel full of grief and loss and unfulfillment. Another deeply ironic twist to the story is that Newland's own son by May, Dallas, terrible name to call a son, is free from his parents' prejudices and dead codes, and is engaged to be married to the illegitimate daughter of one of the most disreputable scoundrels of his father's youth, Julius Beaufort. You probably remember if you read the book. But Newland cannot adapt. And even though by the end of the book, when he goes with Dallas to Paris on a business trip, even by the end of the book, with May dead, when he's given the chance, and this is a very puzzling bit of the book, when he's given the chance to meet Ellen again in her little flat in a chic Parisian neighborhood, in the final scene of the book, he chooses not to do so. It's more real to me here, he says in Extract 8, than if I went up, he suddenly heard himself say. And the fear lest that last shadow of reality should lose its edge kept him rooted to his seat as the minutes succeeded each other. He sat for a long time on the bench in the thickening dust, his eyes never turning from the balcony. At length, a light shone through the windows, and a moment later a manservant came out on the balcony, drew up the awnings and closed the shutters. This is the very last bit of the book. At that, as if it had been the signal he waited for, Newland Archer got up slowly and walked back alone to the hotel. He is, of course, literally shut out from the life going on within. Son's there, Ellen's there, he could be there, and he chooses not to. And however modern Wharton's viewpoint seems in that coda, the main action of the book is set back very much in the atmosphere of the 1870s. That is to say, 40 years from the time of its publication in 1920. Over 40 years. This has a distancing effect and may, as several critics have suggested, be an exercise in consolatory remembering, because this was a period in the 1920s, when Edith had been through the First World War in France. I mean, she did wonderful things. She set up a hospital at her own expense. She didn't write at all during the war except to help the war effort. And she became deeply involved in France's fate. She had been living in France for some time by then with a house still in New York. And really, it's as though she's looking back from a period of great hardship for the French, great hardship, great suffering for Europe generally with that dreadful First World War. And she's looking back and thinking of a softer time, but more innocent, ? Perhaps not. Millicent Bell, in the Cambridge Companion to Wharton, writes, "The Age of Innocence was composed in the first read in the aftermath of World War I, and she suggests that we frame the ending remembering the multiple losses, the destruction of the pre-war world, and all that Edith Wharton valued in it." Because, of course, with World War I, a definite line had been crossed. There would be no return to New York of old, from which Edith was raised. And there's a certain tenderness, certainly a sort of tongue-in-cheek feel to some of those passages. The Age of Innocence also replays, in a historical form, her current feelings about America versus Europe. I mean, Ellen cannot understand the limitedness of New York society when she returns from Europe. But then the Europeans, and doesn't this remind you of Henry James, to whom we'll come in a minute, Ellen doesn't understand theirs, but then, of course, the Americans think that the Europeans are very corrupt. And we'll see that later on when we discover that Mrs. Manson Mingot's bedroom can be viewed through an open door as she entertains her visitors. She's too fat to get upstairs. And one further impetus for writing The Age of Innocence, apart from expressing that grief, that sense of loss, and of course of talking about America versus Europe, one further impetus may have been quite simply to make money, because she made a great deal of money out of an earlier novel set in New York, The House of Mirth, which was in 1905, and which you may know of, a very good novel. And now she returns to it from Europe, where she has set most of her books. It was, in other words, a shrewd career move, as well as everything else. Wharton wrote over 25 books of fiction in all, most of them novels, some novellas, some collections of short stories, starting with her first attempt, Fast and Loose, lovely title for a young lady of 16 to call her book Fast and Loose at the age of 16. It wasn't published till 1977. The Age of Innocence was her 12th novel, possibly her greatest work. I certainly find it so, but you may prefer some of the others. She also wrote and co-wrote, and I think this is very interesting, a book on New York houses and the decoration of New York houses. She wrote an autobiography, A Backward Glance, much too discreet to be entirely interesting, and a travel book, well, many travel books, in fact, as did Henry James, and 3 collections of poetry. She started by writing poetry, interestingly. The Age of Innocence, and this was really an extraordinary achievement, won the Pulitzer Prize, and she was the first, in 1921, the first female American novelist to do so. They were going to give it to Sinclair, is it Sinclair Lewis, do I mean? Whose book they didn't quite approve of. So they gave it to Edith Wharton instead. Not a very good way to win the Pulitzer Prize, I feel, but never mind, she got it. Even a brief glance at her life suggests that The Age of Innocence is a kind of autobiography, particularly in its portrayal of the yearning and unfulfilled love between Newland Archer and Ellen Olenska. Edith Newbold Jones. Let me get to Edith Newbold Jones. Not pretty, strong, attractive, but not pretty. Well, not if you saw her at certain angles, she wasn't pretty. Anyway, she was born in New York on the 24th of January, 1862, so 10 years before the opening of the book that she has for herself. 155 years ago tomorrow, actually. Think of that. So we're celebrating Edith Wharton. Like so many of her future characters, she's born into what we call old money, that layer of New York society that could take education, cultural refinement, and deference to class for granted. The youngest of the family, hers was not a particularly happy childhood. She didn't get on with her mother. Surprise, surprise. I mean, you know, it's so often the story of female writers. But she wasn't indiscreet about her mother. And in fact, I think she was probably a little unfair to her mother, who paid for her first collection of poetry to be published. She felt slighted by her, and her mother was a very social lady who wanted a good marriage for Edith, not successful publication. But she was certainly a very privileged child, growing up the first 4 years of her life in New York City. She was then whisked off to Europe. This was the time just after the American Civil War. And of course, economically, it was a bit dicey. And her father, who was a businessman, decided it would be much cheaper to live abroad. So she went abroad with the family and had that wonderful education that I think I'd have liked, where you learn languages without having to learn languages. So she spoke German, she spoke Italian, she spoke French, all of them very well indeed. And she became herself Europeanized to a large extent. Educated by a series of governesses, one of whom was so close to her that she became her secretary in later life. So But she was also very active in the social and political scene. And at the age of 23, having returned to New York some time before, she made a suitable marriage to, I can't say that I find him very attractive, but perhaps he is, Edward Wharton. You may like the dogs, though. Maybe that's what she liked. But she did all the usual things. And I tell you this not because I want to just tell you things about her, but because, of course, it all comes into her book. All the social occasions. Do you remember when they go off to Newport for their holidays, when they have their soirees, when they go to the opera? All of those things are part of Edith's own life. And there is not anything in this book that is really invented. There's no detail. It carries an authenticity about it. That scene at the opera was a scene that Edith herself, of course, had witnessed many times. So when she married at the age of 23 to that suitable husband, Edward Wharton, a man of correct Boston ancestry, they settled into a busy social life of the kind that, of course, Newland has to undergo in The Age of Innocence with May. There were no children. Edith threw her energies into being a society matron. New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and Paris. Later, at a large house she had built for her. So she was interested in those things. She was interested in the decoration of houses, but and there are points at which, you remember the lovely description of the house that May Welland's father has decided that they can move into. And it's a sort of rather nasty yellowy green, which is possibly preferable to that chocolate brown sauce that covers all the other houses in lower New York. And the little touches that show you this is a person who has looked at New York, has looked at its visual side. Her marriage to Teddy, who was an amiable but increasingly unstable man, was not a success. It was to last 28 increasingly unhappy years, and ended, much to her distress, in divorce in 1913, because she didn't really approve of divorce. It was legal by that time in New York, but New York society still disapproved of it intensely, and Edith, for all her enlightenment, was part of that. Long before this point had been reached, however, she had started to rebel in other directions. Her first published work, The Decoration of Houses, a work of non-fiction co-written with Ogden Codman Jr., lovely name, in 1897, criticised the standards of taste shown by her parents. The effects of social snobbery based on economic status, themes that you'll recognise only too easily in The Age of Innocence. Her decision to write sprang almost certainly from a sense of imprisonment within this decent, respectable, dull society, which would be reflected in Age of Innocence. I don't know whether you got this sense, but I get it very, very clearly from the novel, which reflects a lot of Edith's own problems. In the book, for instance, Ellen and Newland experience a strong sense of isolation, of loneliness. And the words lonely and being alone, I believe the book ends, doesn't it, with that word alone, walk back alone to his hotel. They become key words for both Newland and Ellen, who have been ostracised to some extent. The hollow mockery of Newland's marriage, which recalls Edith Wharton's own. The critical reception of Ellen as a woman with a failed marriage living alone in Europe, which of course she was after 1913, is reflected in the fate that waits for Ellen when she goes back to Paris. And the picture of old New York, drawn from life as it clearly is the world of Edith's childhood. She was 10, as I told you, when the book opens. Recognisable portraits from her own life are many. Particularly, I mean, there's a list I could give you, but particularly her pioneering great-aunt, Mrs. Mason Jones, who in the novel, of course, becomes Mrs. Manson Mingott, is brilliantly recreated in that book. And I have to read you that passage because, and it's extract 13. We won't read all of it, but I urge you to go back if you want to laugh at any point. If you feel depressed, just read this passage. Newland, this is extract 13, and I think it also points to the brilliance of her character creation and her ability to paint a character, not just the outside, although the outside is brilliantly done, but what is going on and what other people think about her and how she reacts to the disapproval that she might have encountered from society by really just defying them all. The immense accretion of flesh which had descended on her in middle life like a flood of lava on a doomed city had changed her from a plump, active little woman with a neatly turned foot and ankle into something as vast and august as a natural phenomenon. She had accepted this submergence as philosophically as all her other trials. And now, in extreme old age, she was probably all of 60, I have to warn you, in extreme old age, was rewarded by presenting to her mirror an almost unwrinkled expanse of firm pink and white flesh, in the centre of which the traces of a small face survived as if waiting excavation. A flight of smooth double chins led down to the dizzy depths of a still snowy bosom, veiled in snowy muslins that were held in place by a miniature portrait of the late Mr. Mingott. He didn't survive very long in the marriage, I might say. And around and below were wave after wave of black silk, which surged away over the edges of a capacious armchair, with two tiny white hands poised like gulls on the surface of the billows. Now, so far so good, and that is, of course, the most extraordinarily vivid picture of what the woman looks like. The burden of Mrs. Manson Mingott's flesh, here comes the serious bit, had long since made it impossible for her to get up and down stairs, and with characteristic independence, she had made her reception rooms upstairs and established herself in flagrant violation of all the New York proprieties on the ground floor of her house, so that as you sat in her sitting room window with her, you caught, through a door that was always open and a looped-back yellow damask portiere, the unexpected vista of a bedroom with a huge low bed upholstered like a sofa and a toilet table with frivolous lace flounces and a gilt-framed mirror. Well, okay, so far so good. Her visitors were startled. Now, I think this conveys old New York to us more clearly than anything else, their attitude towards seeing a glimpse of a bedroom. It's like seeing an ankle, you know? Her visitors were startled and fascinated by the foreignness of this arrangement, which recalled scenes in French fiction and architectural incentives to immorality, such as the simple American had never dreamt of. That was how women with lovers lived, in wicked societies, in apartments with all the rooms on one floor and all the indecent propinquities, sorry, I can't say it, propinquities of their novels described. It amused Newland Archer, who had secretly situated the love scenes of Monsieur de Camors in Mrs. Mingott's bedroom, to picture her blameless life, led in the stage setting of adultery. But he said to himself with considerable admiration that if a lover had been what she wanted, the intrepid woman would have had him too. She's such a good writer. I mean, and her insight into this woman is also good, but that is rather an indulgence. And what I really want to talk to you about is what this book is about. I've made the point that nothing is wasted from the past. The book is set in her own place, the place she knows so well. She brings it to life. It's far more than a thinly concealed biography, autobiography. It's also a book about some important issues, one of the most important of which is the position of women in society. Take, for instance, and this is extract 9, take, for instance, the scene in which Sillerton Jackson, who's an old fogey, unmarried old fogey, who goes and dines with everybody, preferably the ones who have a good cook, but who goes to dine. Sillerton Jackson goes to dinner with the Archers, the Newland Archers, after which the ladies, quote, dutifully trailed their long silk draperies up to the drawing room while the gentlemen smoke below. And this is the important message. While this rite was in progress, second paragraph, in the drawing room, Archer settled Mr. Jackson in an armchair near the fire in the Gothic library and handed him a cigar. Mr. Jackson sank into the armchair with satisfaction, lit his cigar with perfect confidence, it was Newland who bought them, and stretching his thin old ankles to the coals, said, "You say the secretary merely helped her to get away, my dear fellow. Well," this is Ellen's escapade, "well, he was still helping her a year later then, for somebody met 'em living in Lausanne together." Newland reddened. Living together? Well, why not? Who had the right to make her life over if she hadn't? I'm sick of the hypocrisy that would bury women alive, would bury alive a woman of her age if a husband prefers to live with harlots. He stopped and turned away angrily to light his cigar. Women ought to be free as we are, he declared, making a discovery of which he was too irritated to measure the terrific consequences. He stopped and turned away angrily. Sorry, I've done that one. Mr. Sillerton Jackson stretched his ankles near the coals and emitted a sardonic whistle. "Well," he said after a pause, "apparently Count Olenski takes your view, for I never heard of his having lifted a finger to get his wife back." It's equally concerned, the novel, with the double standards, the hypocrisy of this so-called age of innocence, represented so ironically by old New York. And also, it's about people, how can I put this? It's about people watching each other. There's an awful lot of surveillance in the novel. Do you remember at the beginning, they all have opera glasses. They're all looking at each other. And because of this, because they can never move without being observed, they have this feeling of imprisonment. At least Newland does. He goes out for a walk, for example, and everywhere he goes, he knows where everybody else is going. He knows so-and-so is going to visit his cousins, he knows so, and so it goes on. But he himself knows that he too is observed wherever he goes. The theme itself mirrored brilliantly in a style packed with imagery of spies and observers, like that of the opening scene, also of failed attempts at secrecy and concealment. And just really, if we can squeeze this in, hand in hand with this goes claustrophobic imagery of imprisonment and entrapment. And this is the last extract I'll read. Take Newland on his pre-marriage round of duty visits, for instance, 11. Packed in the family landau, they rolled from one tribal doorstep to another. And Archer, when the afternoon's round was over, parted from his betrothed with the feeling that he had been shown off like a wild animal, cunningly trapped. He supposed that his reading in anthropology caused him to take such a coarse view of what was, after all, a simple and natural demonstration of family feeling. But when he remembered that the Wellens did not expect the wedding to take place till the following autumn, and pictured what his life would be till then, a dampness fell upon his spirits. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Welland called after him, "we'll do the Chiverses and the Dallases." and he perceived that she was going through their two families alphabetically, and that they were only in the first quarter of the alphabet. I mean, she is so brilliant because she's funny. She's very, very funny, but she's making a point, isn't she? And when he thinks, sitting in Count Eleanor Lenska's wonderful exotic drawing room, and he thinks of what May Welland's drawing room will be like, his spirits